Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology, and today the topic of our episode is firesetting, and we are absolutely honoured to be joined on screen today with Professor Theresa Gannon, who knows a thing or two about why people set fires. Theresa is a chartered forensic psychologist and a professor of forensic psychology at the University of Kent, and Theresa is also the director of the Centre of Research and Education in Forensic Psychology. So we're looking forward to hearing a little bit more about that later on. Over the past few years, amongst many other achievements, Theresa has developed 2 empirically based standardised treatment programmes for people who have set fires. And again, we're hoping to talk about those with you a bit later on. So thank you so much for joining us, Theresa. We really are so grateful to have you with us. And we're just hoping to kick things off really with asking a little bit about yourself and tell us about your journey into who you are today, really.
Wow, thank you for that invitation and that lovely introduction. It's great. It's nice to be here today, and it's lovely to be talking about fire setting because it's a really, it really is an area that I'm passionate about and that I want to talk to other people about. So it's great we're talking about that today. In terms of how did I get to where I am? I mean, how far back do you want to go? That's the question.
The very beginning.
Okay. Well, gosh, I can go way back to kind of some of my choices I made, I suppose, in terms of I wasn't really doing very good in secondary school, and it took quite a special head teacher to tap me on the shoulder and say, Gannon, you need to get working. So I really wasn't doing very well, and I wasn't applying myself, and I didn't really have any academic background or any role models in that way. So you know, I didn't come from a background where it was just you're going to go to university and that's it. So I flunked a lot of my GCSEs, didn't do very well, got shoulder tapped by the head teacher who said, come on Gannon, you can do better than this. I remember it specifically, him tapping me on the shoulder and talking to me like that. Sounds a bit like a prison officer, doesn't it, in a way? Gannon, you could do better than this.
I was just thinking that with the surname thing, it actually sounded a bit like that.
Yeah. And so basically I owe a lot to him really, because he recognised that I was just messing about and not applying myself, and perhaps I did have a bit more ability than I thought. So I ended up doing an A-level in psychology amongst a few other different A-levels, and I, for the first time, I kind of experienced a bit of success. And it just went from there really. I went to the University of Birmingham and I had this really interesting lecture on the cognition of people who've offended sexually against children. And I just thought, oh my God, that is so interesting. So I ended up, because my friends were all talking about PhDs, I didn't really know what a PhD was. I had no idea, because again, I wasn't from a background where people had PhDs or went to university and things like that. So I decided I really wanted to work with people who sexually offended against children. So I ended up choosing a PhD on that topic area and working at the University of Sussex on that. But for one reason or another, all my supervisors kind of, you know, had to leave or had problems. And so I didn't receive loads of supervision. And because of that, though, I think it made me a much more resilient person in terms of counting on myself rather than other people. So although the experience was really difficult for me, I kind of learned that I had to rely on myself, and I think that put me in good stead for later, that you had to rely on your own ideas and just think, oh yeah, that's a good one, or that's not quite as good a one. And then I ended up applying for a postdoc in New Zealand, and I did 2 postdocs in New Zealand, both working with or researching people who sexually offended. And one was with people who had raped adults, men who had raped adults, and the other one was more kind of rehabilitation focused, and that was with Tony Ward.
Who does the Good Life models, which is always something, and actually we really use that model so regularly, but it's been great to work with him.
Yeah, it was great, and he was a really fantastic mentor. he taught me a lot about, I tended to have a few perfectionist kind of, you know, ways of dealing with things back then. I still do, I suppose. Lots of us do, don't they? But he was very good at kind of enabling me to work through that so that I actually produce something rather than, you know, lots of unfinished projects, which can be easy to do. But I ended up finishing my PhD out there and, you know, working all weekends and working really long hours trying to get it finished whilst doing my postdoc at the same time. But it was a great time in my life. It was really great, and I learned absolutely heaps from just moving to another country and working with people who were culturally quite different.
Quite a different judicial system, quite a different criminal justice system in New Zealand.
I would say some of it is modelled quite similarly to us, but it was more that kind of, you'll kind of know what I mean when I say, like, you know, when you're interviewing someone who's offended and they're talking about their childhood or something, and I don't know, they'll use particular words or slang and things like that, and you'll be like, oh yeah, I understand that, I know that. And I found that when I moved out there, although it looked similar and we all speak English and, you know, it looked similar, when you went and interviewed people, they'd be talking about things and I wouldn't really understand what they were talking about. And I felt a bit kind of, I suppose, like I had to really up my game in terms of learning about Maori background and how they kind of prioritise family more than, say, European individuals would, and how important that is for treatment and research as well. You know, they'd often want to talk to their family members about things and that type of thing.
Wow.
So, gosh, I feel like I'm really going a long-winded way around this, but I sometimes feel it's important because we think, oh, you know, there's one pathway or whatever. So when I finished in New Zealand, I was on fixed-term contracts and I decided, you know, I'd have a look around, see what there was going in terms of academic contracts. And I saw there was a contract at the University of Kent. So I thought, I'll give that a go, because there wasn't anything in New Zealand at that time that was like permanent. And so that's how I ended up back over in the UK. And I'd done a little bit of practice stuff all the way through, like from PhD up until when I got to Kent. And I decided I was going to go for my chartership and apply to be a practitioner as well. So I made an application and I got rejected. And I got rejected because I think the panel said I had too much of my portfolio was based on sexual offending and not enough of other things, which, looking back, they were completely right. So I ended up approaching a local medium secure forensic hospital for people who've offended, and the head of psychology there at the time was brilliant, Lona Lockerbie. She kind of invited me in with open arms and just gave me the opportunity. And I got to work with, you know, men, women, all different types of offences, different units in KMPT. So that was really good for me, actually. And I ended up getting my practitioner status 2007, I think it was. And then I've been there ever since. They haven't got rid of me now. So I'm kind of a practitioner in KMPT, the NHS, essentially.
What a fascinating journey into the kind of forensic psychology world, from research into practice. I was just really curious about when did you start to get an interest in kind of fire setting?
So my interest in fire setting, I've got a pinnacle moment where it came from, and I remember it really well, was it was probably just after I'd got my practitioner status, and I was asked in the NHS to go and assess someone who, for a relatively straightforward sexual offence, and to work out what their treatment pathway would be. So I went to go and see this individual, and I interviewed him in depth and looked at all of his background. And the sexual offending element of it, I was able to kind of look at quite clearly and put forward a treatment pathway. But I came away really kind of troubled by it, really, because I could see that this guy had a lot of fire setting or arson in his background. And I could see that he had come into the unit and it just hadn't been addressed. And I kind of went away really troubled, thinking, well, I've been asked to look at sexual offending for this person, but in my view, it's this other element in his background which really needs addressing. I can deal with that aspect of it, and I know where to kind of channel that, but this fire setting really needs looking at. And from that moment, I remember going back to the university and thinking, I've got to do a review on fire setting. I've got to look at what is there available and what can I draw upon. And I found it really fascinating, because when I completed the review with a colleague, Aphrodite Pina, we realised that there really wasn't much at all to draw upon. And I just found it shocking. I thought, I've got to do something about this. And I suppose that's where the research and practice really came hand in hand for me. That was where it was a really important moment for me. And then I thought, I felt so passionate about having to do something, because I could see from working in sexual offending how well developed that field was. It's so well developed compared to fire setting. I thought, well, surely I can use my knowledge from that field to try and improve this one and get things going. And then I applied for a grant with a certain body, and I put in for a grant to get some funding, and to my surprise and pleasure, we got it. And that's what kick-started, really, at least my relationship with learning about fire setting and trying to kind of kickstart things.
What part of that process did you start to think, I can understand why people set fires?
I think it's been a journey. I think I'm still understanding why people set fires even today. But I think back then, I think what I was piecing together was the literature kind of saying, well, people set fires because they're interested in them, because they want to draw attention to their need, to kind of cry for help, because they want to have some kind of recognition, you know, the hero fire setter who comes in and saves the day. So I was piecing together that element of it, what people were telling me. And then I was coming across people in practice, who I'm sure, you know, many of you have, where I was thinking, but what about this guy who's really antisocial, who set fire to a car? Where does he fit in? Does he need treatment or not? Or is he just an antisocial, violent person who I should just track down another channel? What do I do with someone who set fire to a person? What do I do about all of these things? This bit over here that I'm reading about isn't helping me to explain all the people I'm coming across, and so there's something missing.
What do you do at that point when you think there's something missing?
Well, I suppose for me, that's where I decided that we had to have a new theory to explain adult deliberate fire setting. And so previous to that, some of you may have worked with it already, but previous to that, there was one kind of key theory we used to use, which was Jackson's theory. And that assumes that people all set fires generally because they're interested in fires. And I was coming across people who genuinely were telling me they weren't interested in it, but they did keep misusing it.
What's the difference between being a fire setter and being an arsonist?
Okay, that's a really good question, Emily. So basically, essentially, arson is a legal term, and it varies across jurisdictions and countries, but generally it's used to refer to a deliberate fire set to property. Fire setting is a much broader term. I tend to use the term fire setting because it encapsulates people who have set fires but haven't been legally recorded as arson or convicted as an arson offence. So to give you an example, you can have people who set fires in prisons to their cells, but they may not get a criminal offence of arson on their history for one reason or another, or people may not even, it may not fit the kind of criteria to go forward for a prosecution. Also, we have what's called the principal crime counting rule, which means if there's a complex series of events in a crime, so let's say someone has murdered someone and then they've set fire to the house with the body inside, then only the most serious offence will be counted. So the murder will be counted, but the arson won't be, because the most serious offence takes kind of precedence there. So essentially, there are lots of reasons why a fire setting event just won't be recorded as an arson. And that's why I prefer to use the term fire setting, because it means that we have got everyone then who might have a problem with fire, who we need to reduce their risk of setting a deliberate fire, rather than just these people who happen to have an offence of arson on record.
I think there's a lot of guys that I think we've all worked with who, you know, part of communicating distress, they might set fire to their cell, or they'll throw paper under their door to try to set fire to the wing. Or, and I was just really curious when you were talking, Theresa, about the other theories that you've kind of come up with, and about some of the other functions, I guess, the fire setting might serve.
Yeah, sure. So just looping back, I mean, basically, I was dissatisfied with the fact that the current theories I was trying to use didn't recognise people who weren't interested in fire. And I think what we ended up doing was saying, right, let's take all the literature that we have in the area of fire setting and what we know clinically from working with these people, and knit it together into one overarching theory of what we think is going on with adult deliberate fire setting. And I think the key thing that we came up with, which I believe has been missing all the time, is the concept of a fire script. So all of us, a script is really a set of cognitive rules for when and how something should be used. So all of us, you and I, will have a script about fire, which will probably go something like, fire's nice as long as it's used safely. So I might light a candle in my room to change the kind of mood, or to make it smell nice, or I might sit next to a fire in a pub and that's a lovely experience. But if it's not used carefully, it's not a nice experience. Whereas some of the people that we might come across who've perhaps set a deliberate fire have developed what we call an inappropriate fire script. And an inappropriate fire script is where there's been a problem really in how they've developed their cognitive rules for how and when fire should be used. So to give you an example, you could have young people who've learned quite by accident that fire is a good way to cope with situations, because people come running really quickly. It's an instant way to grab attention. So perhaps you've got a child who has neglectful parents. Accidentally they set fire to something, the parents come running, and so you can see that over the years perhaps this child may develop a fire coping script, we call it. And then another example would be fire being used to conceal evidence script, so where people perhaps have been brought up in a kind of antisocial background, you know, and they've seen lots of crime taking place, and they've developed a script that fire is the best way to conceal evidence. You know, it destroys it instantly, and I'm talking about, you know, the burning out of cars that have been stolen and that type of thing. But we kind of believe that the script element is what has been missing from previous theories, because if you have a script about when fire should be used and it's not quite right, then that would account for why people are using it repetitively to get their needs met, but they're not necessarily interested in fire.
I think I was wondering about the emotional attachment. I think, and I was recalling somebody I'd worked with actually before, and how his fire setting felt very much about angry moments in his life, almost not revengeful, but more about expressing his anger. How does emotions fit with a script? Is that something that gets very much thought about in that idea of a script?
Oh yeah, well I think it's interesting, but I think that they're kind of almost inextricably linked, aren't they, emotion and cognition? And so, you know, the script almost gets fired off instantly if you're feeling emotional, for example. So you can see how they would work hand in hand. But often, you know, we know with a lot of different crimes, there's a lot of strong emotion behind them often as well. And typically in the lead up to a fire setting offence, people will tend to be like really angry, or might be really excited, or really sad, or really disappointed. And you tend to see that a lot, I think, with those types of behaviours. But I always think fire setting is so fascinating because there's so many different motives behind it, that if you're a problem solver, it's a great kind of offence to be working on and working out with the individual. What did happen here? You know, let's understand this together. How did this come about? How does this repeatedly keep coming about?
Are there any links to sexual offending and fire setting?
Quilter O'Keara has written a really good chapter on this in the book, The Psychology of Firesetting. Is it Psychology of Firesetting? Psychology of Arson. And essentially, he looks at all the literature around that link. And basically, in a nutshell, what's really happened, it seems, is that when Freud talked about firesetting being connected with sexual urges and libido and that type of thing, and set up that way of thinking about firesetting in the 1920s and 30s, that kind of link seems to have persisted in people's minds, that there must be a link about these two behaviours. But in actual fact, as Quilter says in his chapter, although sexual offending and firesetting might have some similar kind of background factors, there's no real evidence to link sexual impulses to firesetting. Occasionally you might come across someone where there's some type of sexual gratification there, but it's really unusual. I think I've only come across one person in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people I've ever interviewed. So it's a link that persists, but there's not much empirical evidence behind it.
It's really good to clear that up. You heard it here first, everyone.
Is there any differences between men and women in terms of their fire setting and the motives behind it?
A little bit, but it kind of goes with what we know about offending behaviour in men and women more generally, I would say. So those antisocial type individuals who might use fire to conceal a crime tend to more likely be men. The cry for help type individual who sets fire to show people they need help because they're not able to control their emotions, perhaps can be connected with borderline personality disorder as well, tend to be more female, not always obviously, but that would tend to be the kind of pattern. Fire interest, I would say, people who, are driven by just an interest in fire, men and women, I tend to see both. But I would say that women tend to kind of have more of that emotional connection, coping using fire, that type of thing, whereas men, it can be a bit more antisocial. There's a certain subtype we talk about in our theory called the multifaceted fire setter, and that's a person who's quite antisocial but they really love fire as well. And again, you can find men and women who fit that, but you tend to more often see men, or at least in my experience, fit that kind of pathway.
My question was quite similar to Kate's in some way, whether or not you see a prevalence perhaps in adolescents, men, women. Is there predominantly numbers higher in any of those areas?
In terms of adolescents, we've done some really fascinating studies actually recently. I don't know if you've kind of had a chance to see them, but they're looking at unapprehended fire setting in the community, and asking people whether they've ever set a deliberate fire that they haven't been apprehended for. And we found literally about 13% of a really large sample, representative sample in one Kent borough, admitted that they'd set a fire that they'd never been apprehended for. And we tended to find that when people were recalling when they'd set that fire, it was more often in teenage years, and it tended to be for excitement, because they were bored, because of peer pressure, and they tended to come from quite educated backgrounds as well, interestingly. So yeah, I don't work specifically in the kind of adolescent area, but they do tend to make up a large proportion of the cases that we tend to see. I think for apprehended samples, it's 50 to 60%.
Oh,
wow, that's quite a lot.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
What made you move into the area of treatment programs then?
Yeah, I think it was all based on that one person that I spoke about earlier, when I realised that he needed an intervention and we didn't really have anything. And then I thought, well, if we don't have anything, then that means that lots of other places don't have anything too. And I was aware there were some places that had treatments. You know, some hospitals had developed their own in-house treatment. So I was really fortunate enough that where I was working in NHS, that the head of psychology there was very supportive and said, just develop something, that's fine, and we can test it here. And then if we think it's, you know, a good model, then perhaps, you know, you can work on that and rolling it out. And so that's exactly what we did. We tested it. And the first group, oh my goodness, it was so difficult. It felt like a disaster. Just because I think all the people that we had on the first group were really not motivated to partake. So it was filled with people who didn't want to be there, were pretending they'd fallen asleep. I mean, it was just, you know, a facilitator's nightmare.
I think we've all been there.
And so that first group didn't go particularly well. So we had to have another go. And I don't think, actually looking back, I don't think it was the programme. I think, like I say, it just happened to be this mix of people that weren't quite ready for treatment. And so the next one was much more successful. And we felt it had more legs. And that's when I kind of wrote up the manual. And which took a bit of time actually, but wrote up the manual. And then we kind of, myself and Nicola Tyler, who was doing a PhD at the time, we said, why don't we invite people from other NHS trusts to come and hear about the programme, and they can have a go at running it. So it was like a real pragmatic trial, if you like, because we were sending other people off to their different institutions to run it based on, you know, our account of how we felt it should be run. And they went off and they tested, looked at certain attributes before treatment and after treatment, or characteristics, to see if anything had changed. And then they fed it back to us, and Nicola wrote her PhD on that. So her PhD was evaluating the effectiveness of this new treatment programme within the NHS. And then soon after that, we thought, well, if we're delivering it in NHS, we should really try and make sure we deliver it in the prisons as well. And that was a really different experience, really different, because we definitely felt we had more antisocial individuals, I think, and groups were a lot more lively, and you had to be a lot more on your toes, really, in that environment. And there were a lot more, we felt there were a lot more logistical things that we had to sort out in that environment, you know. The groups in prisons, you know, they were like, sometimes they were like 10 in a group. Yeah, and I decided, rightly or wrongly, that, you know, because we'd got this funding to evaluate the treatment, because I applied for this funding to evaluate the treatment, I decided that I wanted to kind of really be at the cold face with it and be providing it with a team of other people and some other psychologists. But, you know, I ended up kind of going in there quite a lot, really, every week. And it became part of my life, really. You know, I was delivering it for quite a while. And it was challenging. I think as a group, we all worked together as a team. We had this kind of FIP team on a particular wing, and we had an office there, and it was great. It was a really nice time, but it was challenging, really challenging.
And FIP being, do you want to say the acronym?
Firesetting Intervention Programme for Prisoners. Although I would change that title now to be a bit more strengths-based and a bit more positive. But it's become known as that. But
what would you change it to?
Oh, I don't know. I'll tell you what we do now. Well, what I do now in a group is, if we start the group, we normally say, what do you guys want to call the group? And then we kind of guide them to come up with something nice and positive, you know, rather than, you know, the arsonist treatment programme or something. And then that allows us, let's say they come up with something like, I don't know, stepping forward group, or whatever it is what they want to call it, then it's nice to be able to call it that on the wing or the ward, because it's not stigmatizing. And they've chosen it.
I think that's really important. I think as a team we've really thought about language, and you were saying earlier about Tony Ward, and this whole idea about strengths-based fits really nicely with values and trying to align yourselves with something that you know, why would you want to align yourself with being an arsonist? You want to be a person that's, you know, stepping forward and doing pro-social things.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
and, you know,
right.
Ruth Mann used to say, why would you call someone the very thing you want them to move away from? And I think that's a really powerful statement and really links in with that. And I guess, Theresa, I was really curious. I think people will be interested to know what's unique about the programme that you've developed. And how is it different, I guess, to other interventions that are available?
Yeah, I think what's unique about it for people who set fires is that it looks at, number one, fire interest in quite a bit of detail. What's inappropriate fire interest? How would you know if you're inappropriately interested in fire? But it also uses behavioural techniques to try and shift any inappropriate fire interest that has been strengthened over the years. It also looks at people's identity as someone who's set fire for many years, which is often the case. People have developed a strong affinity with fire, you know, they really feel connected with it. And most importantly, it looks at inappropriate fire scripts, which I was talking about earlier. So, you know, what are they? Why do I keep continuing to misuse fire? And some people are really confused by that. You know, they think, well, I'm not interested in fire. Why do I keep using it then? What is it? And it's about giving them some kind of insight into that so they can understand it and choose whether they want to, you know, desist from that behaviour. Because as I often say to people when we're working in practice, as a psychologist, I think we can give people the tools to try and help them to desist. Whether they want to take forward those tools is their job, but I know I've done my job if I give them those tools.
Do they like the idea of the script? It sounds like you know, sometimes it's almost, you know, like a formulation. You're giving someone a narrative about why they're doing the things that they do. Do they like the idea of the word script?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we don't even say the word script, you know, we'll put it forward in simpler terms than that. But generally, I think people connect with it well. I'm thinking particularly of someone who we had, who we assessed to come on the programme. And again, they were one of those people who were under the principal crime counting rule. So they'd engaged in quite a serious violent offence and then set fire. They saw no reason for them to be on the programme at all. And they didn't want to come on the programme. They didn't want to be connected with fire setting in any way. And we said, hey, you know, just come onto the programme, see how you find it after the first few weeks, and we can work on, you know, the kind of violence as well while we're looking at it, what led up to that. And over the weeks, it became really apparent that this person did have a script around fire setting. And you could see this kind of light bulb moment where the whole group were like, oh yeah, that's what it is. That's what kind of led to that piece in the puzzle. When we approach people to take part in a group, people find the idea of coming onto a group for fire setting really stigmatizing. And that shocked us to start with, because having worked with sexual offending, you're used to that. But I kind of thought, well, with fire setting, I'm sure it won't be, you know, as deeply entrenched as that, but it is. Lots of people don't want to come onto a group about fire setting, I think, because of these stereotypes of fire setters. You know, if you think about that song by The Prodigy, it's like twisted fire setter and all that there's something wrong with you, you're compulsive, you're mentally ill, there's a problem sexually or whatever it is. And so we still have problems with that, recruiting people to come on the programme.
There is a prison hierarchy, isn't there? And well, despite people saying there isn't, there seems to be. And fire setting arsonists tend to be quite lowly ranked in that hierarchy, in my experience. So that
I think certainly, I think you're right, Emily, in terms of, especially if they're kind of a fire interest person and most of their stuff is revolved around fire interest and fire setting. I think if they tend to be one of those people where fire settings just come up as a blip in the background, they tend to go under the radar a bit, the more antisocial types. But perhaps people where they've repeatedly and they're very interested in fire, yeah, I think you're right. Fire setting intervention programme for prisoners and the fire setting intervention programme for people with mental health disorders, they're kind of sister programmes. So essentially they've got the same information in them, but the one for prisoners has got all the mental health stuff in an appendices at the back. And that's because we know that just because you're in prison, it doesn't mean you don't have any mental health disorders, so you still need access to that information. Whereas the one that we use in hospitals for people who have a mental illness, that information about the mental illness tends to be scattered all the way through the programme. And we tend to also look at kind of mental health as one of the modules as well. So, you know, one of the things we look at is when we're dealing with individuals who've had a mental illness and they've set a fire, often they come onto the programme with this perhaps mistaken understanding that it's the mental illness that caused the fire setting. If they hadn't have been mentally unwell, then this fire would never have happened. And there is some truth in that, but the way we kind of work on it in the group and talk about it in the group is that typically mental health symptoms that you might get, you know, even for example, command hallucinations, are simply reflecting underlying factors that were already there perhaps. So, you know, for example, I've had men or women who have command hallucinations to set fire to people's houses. But when you dig underneath the surface, they were already inappropriately interested in fire. And it, you know, that inappropriate interest is simply being revealed in their command hallucinations, if you like. So it's taken them a step further, yeah, but there's still something underneath the mental health that we need to look at. So, you know, I wouldn't be comfortable with that person saying, okay, let's give you some medication. Now you're settled, that's fine, you can just be discharged. So it's about kind of educating them that we need to take a multifaceted approach to that. We need perhaps the medication as well for the mental health, but we also need to tackle this inappropriate fire interest, how it perhaps developed, and so on and so forth.
It's really interesting because I think what you're saying is perhaps that mental health is almost a disinhibitor, much like drugs or alcohol would be, almost something that enables it to happen.
That's right. In most cases, I mean, this is what we say, you know, with our theory of fire setting, you can't fit people into boxes. You're always going to have a case. It doesn't quite fit. But generally, we find it's a kind of disinhibitor. It just takes you a step closer. And if you unravel everything, there's normally something there that was pre-existing, such as fire interest or other problems, for example, yeah. But the fire setting treatment program that we run in prisons and in hospitals, they're essentially very, very similar. And they run over a 6-month period. So they're quite a commitment for psychologists in prisons and hospitals to undertake. And they're a weekly commitment of 2 hours in the group and then an hour of individual work as well. So they are quite a commitment. But we have had really good feedback from clients who've been on either of those courses. Occasionally I'll even get an email in my inbox from someone who attended the course, really appropriate, not inappropriate, just literally just wanted to tell you I'm out, thanks for the fire setting course, it was great. That's it, and I never hear from them again. And I think that's a really nice thing, that it's an appropriate email. It's not kind of, you know, keep emailing me about stuff or anything like that. It's really appropriate. It's just thanks for that, because they just want the opportunity to say that.
It did make me think when you were talking then about the programs, about I think you know, a lot of services are thinking more about trauma and how that fits with some of the programs. Is that something that sort of that's weaved into the programs? That's
a really good question, because obviously things over the past few years have become more trauma informed, or rather treatments have become more trauma informed. So at the moment I'm writing a book about, you know, the process of treatment and how to kind of undertake it, rather than what the treatment looks like. You know, what are the kind of strengths and pitfalls that you need to watch out for? What are the things you need to watch out for? And trauma is one of those things. So our view on it is essentially that the FIP and the FITMO, or the treatment program for people who've set fires in prisons and hospitals, is essentially trauma informed to a certain extent. So we recognise people's traumas in that complex tapestry of what's led them to who they are today, and we kind of acknowledge those traumas. But if we believe that someone really is experiencing a high level of trauma that would impact on their ability to take on board talking therapy, or that they may be at risk of being seriously re-traumatized by coming onto one of our groups, then we normally kind of refer them for trauma resolution first, and that's the way we kind of approach it. And in the early days, we kind of didn't so much do that, and I think that was a mistake, and I think that that's something that we do much more now. But sometimes you'll find that can't be done sometimes in the system, which is really frustrating. You'll refer someone for that work, it can't be done, and then they're stuck, and that's really frustrating too. So I guess, as much as it can be, it's trauma informed, but it's tricky, isn't it? Once you're part of any system, it becomes tricky.
So as we're drawing to a close, we just wanted to ask a couple more questions. So Theresa, what has been your proudest moment in your career so far?
Oh my goodness. I think it's got to be, there's a body called the Economic and Social Research Council, which provided the funding for us to undertake the treatment programme and evaluate it. And they're like a really prestigious funding body. And we, as a team, because I always believe there's a team behind everything that goes on, it's not just me, we were awarded the Outstanding Impact in Society Award in 2016. And that was brilliant because it really kind of highlighted the fact that kickstarting this treatment or knowledge about people who'd set fires had actually had an impact on real people's lives. And that was really important for me because that's where it all started, meeting this man and thinking, oh my goodness, we need to do something. And there was a whole team of us behind that. It certainly wasn't me. I mean, really, there were a team of around 12 people behind all of that work. And unfortunately, they only get a small name check at the end of this award. But I suppose it highlighted to me what can be done if you've got a team of really hardworking people. And it just felt really nice that it had been acknowledged. Yeah.
Oh, that's incredible. And the final question then is, do you have any future plans or aspirations, anything you want to achieve?
The biggest thing in terms of fire setting that I want to do, and I'm working on it now, and I'm continually going back to it because it's a hard one, it's a hard nut to crack, is I really want to get funding to develop a risk assessment tool for people who've set fires, because it's absolute completely. And I've got all the design ready. I just need the funding support, because you need a big team to get that off the ground, really. And yeah, so I'm working on that at the moment. I'm always going back to it. So I'm working on that. And then because I like working in new fields all the time where there's not a lot of psychology, I've developed this interest in missing persons. And so I'm currently working with Kent Police on looking at the predictors of, who goes missing and what the outcomes of those missing episodes might be, and how we can predict them, and whether there's any difference between children who go missing and adults who go missing. So I'm quite interested in starting that line of research off, which is a bit different to the normal stuff that I do with forensic populations, because going missing isn't a crime, but of course it can be connected to criminal behaviour. Either they become victims or they can become gang members or whatever. So yeah, those are my two big kind of projects that I'm thinking about at the moment, I would say.
That feels like a really lovely place to end. So thank you so much for your time, Theresa. It was really enjoyable to hear you talk. And all that is left for us to say is, let's talk forensic psychology.